Good evening. My name is Darren Reesberg, and while I at one point served as the executive director of the Institute of Politics, I greet you tonight on behalf of the university as the university's vice president for strategic initiatives and deputy provost. Prior to coming to the university in 2012, I worked for 7 years in state government here in Illinois. Throughout that time, I had the opportunity to see the critical role that a state attorney general played, along with the office of the state attorney general as the people's lawyer. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight two of our state's attorney generals, Curtis Hill of Indiana and Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who with the help of moderator Jason DeSanto will address the topic of federalism in conflict, the role of attorneys general. In just a moment, our guest will be formally introduced by Catherine Surma, a fourth-year student here in the college from the Chicagoland area who is studying political science and this past summer interned at the U.S. Department of Justice. But first, a few housekeeping points. We will open the floor after the discussion to take questions from the audience, and you can line up. There will be a mic in the center aisle. Priority is given to students for the first three questions, and just as a reminder, a question ends with a question mark. We also ask that you just please make sure to keep your phones on silent if possible so that everybody can enjoy tonight's program. I did want to note that David Axelrod, the Institute director, very much wanted to be here tonight, but unfortunately something came up at the last minute that caused him to be out of town. He wanted me to thank all of you for coming tonight and also wanted me to thank, in particular, our special guests this evening. One other special guest who I'd like to thank for being here is Joe Neubauer, who's the chairman of our university's Board of Trustees, my friend, and as General Shapiro knows well, a Pennsylvanian. With that, I will welcome Catherine to the podium to introduce our special guests for tonight.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's event, Federalism in Conflict, the Role of Attorneys General. In light of recent legal action taken by several attorneys general against the Trump administration for its handling of the Affordable Care Act, the topic of tonight's discussion is legal conflicts between states and the federal government. We are joined today by the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, the Attorney General of Indiana, Curtis T. Hill, Jr., and by Jason DeSanto, a senior lecturer at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, who will be moderating the discussion. Attorney General Shapiro is a lifelong public servant. Prior to being sworn in as the Attorney General of Pennsylvania on January 17, 2017, Shapiro served as the chairman of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, chairman of the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners, and as a state representative for Pennsylvania's 153rd House District. He graduated magna cum laude from the University of Rochester and earned his JD from Georgetown University Law Center. He was raised and currently resides in Montgomery County, where he and his wife, Lori, are raising their 4 children. Attorney General Hill began his legal career as a part-time deputy prosecuting attorney for Elkhart County, where he also maintained a private general practice of law. He was elected prosecuting attorney for Elkhart County in 2002 and was re-elected to the position in 2006, 2010, and 2014, serving a total of 4 terms. He has been a member of the FBI Criminal Justice Information Services Division Advisory Policy Board, Elkhart County Historical Society, and the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in marketing from the Indiana University School of Business in Bloomington and earned his JD from the Indiana University School of Law. He was raised and currently resides in Elkhart County with his wife, Teresa, and his 5 children. Jason DeSanto is a senior lecturer at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. He teaches courses at the intersection of law and public advocacy, including First Amendment law, as well as executive courses in persuasion and leadership at the Northwestern School of Communication. DeSanto has also served for more than 15 years as a political speechwriter and debate strategist, and he has assisted U.S. senators, members of Congress, and multiple American presidential campaigns. He earned his undergraduate degree from Northwestern, concentrating in American rhetorical history and graduating magna cum laude, and earned his JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. DeSanto additionally graduated from the Second City Conservatory and periodically appears as a political satirist and commentator on Chicago radio. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks also to Darren and the Institute and everyone for being here today, and thanks most of all to our two terrific guests. I'm really excited to be here today. We're going to dive into some pressing issues, some long-standing issues, but first I want to resolve a controversy that people have been wondering about for a long time. Is it attorney generals or attorneys general?
It's attorneys general.
There we go. Okay.
And this is our first point of agreement in this discussion right here.
I hope it won't be the last.
There you go.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about that role as an attorney general, but also as it relates to federalism. And when we think of the term federalism, it doesn't necessarily stir the soul until we realize that it's a concept that's been around since the time of the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, right through our debate over slavery and the Civil War, up through the New Deal and the civil rights, and right up until today, with all the challenges to Obamacare, climate change regulations, the Trump travel ban, and a host of other issues, including immigration. So it's here, and it affects us in one way or another. And so I start with our guest tonight, and I ask, based on what you do every single day, how does federalism affect what you do, and how do you think it affects the lives of everyday citizens?
Go ahead. Well, first off, thank you for being here. It's great to be with General Hill and, of course, my great constituent, Joe Neubauer. Thank you for all you do here at the University of Chicago. You're right. When you are the Attorney General, in my case, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and you talk about federalism, that's not exactly the thing that's on most people's minds each and every day. They want safe communities. They want to know that their rights are being protected. They want to know as consumers their interests are going to be looked after. But I submit to you that unless you incorporate federalism into that work, it's impossible to fully protect the interests of the people of your Commonwealth or your state. And so for me, it's really about making sure that each and every one of my constituents knows that I'm upholding the rule of law and I'm protecting their interests. Sometimes their interests are threatened by a drug dealer on the street corner. Sometimes their interests are threatened by some multinational corporation, like a pharmaceutical company or pharmaceutical manufacturer or distributor. And sometimes it's threatened by the federal government. And I fundamentally believe that we need to stand up and protect our citizens from that encroachment by the federal government when it undermines their rights, their safety, or their well-being. So I think federalism is key to what we do. I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think it's rooted in the rule of law. And I think it's frankly an area where Republicans and Democrats find common ground. The newspapers may not write about it that way. Our discussions may turn a little bit partisan in these tense times. But at the end of the day, these are issues that should bring Republicans and Democrats together, and that's how we try to do it in the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office.
And I couldn't agree more. We really have a fourth branch of government, and that's what we do through the states to protect the interests of the states. And one of the reasons that you can see federalism being more and more of an issue these days is, quite frankly, the dysfunction of Congress. Yes. Things don't work in Washington as they should, and as a result of that, you see efforts, certainly with good intentions, but sometimes you see what both of us would consider as executive overreach, and as I say, intended to do well because here's a job that Congress chooses not to do, so it's not unusual for an executive to say, well, I'll do it. But the question becomes, is that within the realm of the Constitution, and how does that impact the states, and what are our rights? So we have a very similar viewpoint with regard to the need for federalism and states protecting their own interests to make their decisions and to have that proper balance between the role of the federal government and the role of the state government.
Okay, so let's step back for a minute before we dive into what that looks like, maybe from a litigation perspective, and talk a little bit about your role as an attorney general more generally. Why did you want the job? What was it about that job that really motivated you as a lawyer to take a run at it? General Hill.
Well, as was mentioned in my bio, I was the prosecuting attorney for 4 terms. Public safety has been at the core of what I've done as a professional. And the opportunity to take that to a statewide level Even though in my state we don't have direct criminal jurisdiction, which I miss, but I do have jurisdiction over criminal appeals. But there's a wide variety of aspects in which I can protect the public through consumer protection, through our advisory opinions, through our position of working with the legislature on enacting legislation, making sure that the right types of bills are going through. It's a unique position in that sense. And in the last several years, I think we've seen the position grow into a more dynamic position. Not only is it our responsibility to address our state responsibilities, our statutory and constitutional responsibilities as Attorney General, but it is a fantastic opportunity to address issues in our communities that need to be addressed and to use that bully pulpit to bring these issues to bear, and what I believe is bringing common sense to resolve situations and find solutions.
General Hill has a great background, and you should read his long bio at some point when you can. We have really different backgrounds. I was not a prosecutor, yet we actually do have vast criminal jurisdiction within my office. I wanted the job because of two reasons. Number one, I fundamentally believe in public service. I hope I can do that throughout my entire career, God willing. But second, I want to be in a job in government where you can actually do something. And when the powers that be in Washington came to me and asked me to run last cycle for the United States Senate, my wife asked me a simple question: why do you want the job? And the truth is, I could never answer that question, because the job I want is one where I can do something every day. And I believe, and I say this with all respect to any other occupant of any other office, there is no better job in American government than being an Attorney General. Every single day when I wake up and go to the office, I can do something. Whether it's prosecuting a drug dealer, or whether it's investigating Equifax, as we're the lead state in that investigation after that huge data breach, or we're working together on the investigation of the opioid manufacturers and distributors, we can have a huge impact on some of the biggest pressing problems that we face in our country today. And I just think it's a terrific job. I want to pick up on something that was asked in your question that General Hill talked about, about Congress really abdicating its responsibility. I mean, they have, and frankly, this is during the Obama years and during the Trump years. They have not stepped up to do their job. And yet, you remember from high school, right, what my kids have learned is, checks and balances are horizontal, right? It's the Congress, it's the judiciary, it's the executive, the president. But what we don't learn in school, but what you're seeing play out in real time today, and one of the things that excites me about being an Attorney General, is not just the horizontal system of checks and balances, but a robust vertical system of checks and balances, where the states become a shield against federal overreach and really a sword to advance the interests and the rights of that state. And again, that's not a partisan issue. That's an issue where the states really have to step up and do their part. And attorneys general are in a unique place to do that, which is why I do this job and why I love this job, and why I just think it's an extraordinary position to be in.
That part of the job, the part that involves checking federal government,
Yeah.
what percentage of your job, if you had to break it down, do you think involves that? And that's really what brings a lot of us here today to talk. It's certainly the part that gets a lot of headlines.
Yeah.
But day to day, all the things you described, legislative advocacy, defending state laws, what percentage really is working with other states on suing the federal government today?
I don't know that I can put a percentage on it. It's because it ebbs and flows. It's a very consistent process. There is always something in play, and yet those things that are in play from a federalism standpoint compete with the other interests that we have in our office. So there's constantly something to look at in terms of evaluating, is this an issue where the federal government has gone too far? Is this an issue where an agency took advantage of a rulemaking process and went around the interest of Congress? What I try to do is evaluate if I believe that it's a situation of overreach, does it affect or impact my state? One of the things I don't want to do, and I'm sure Josh feels the same way, the last thing I want to do is make my decisions on when we engage in what we would consider federal overreach about politics.
Right.
It's important to me to make sure that I'm consistent in the evaluation. Is it something that I think is inappropriate under the Constitution? Do I think it's something that impacts my state? Now, not always do I limit myself to just what impacts my state, because sometimes there's an indirect impact, and we're very cognizant of that as well, the way the law works. something that we don't think is going to bite us in the tail today comes back in a couple weeks. So it's important to look beyond the direct. But it's a very thorough evaluation. So weekly, there are issues that come before us that will go through my Solicitor General's office, and we will evaluate what the ramifications are in terms of state sovereignty, what our responsibility is, and then we'll make decisions based on that.
Same, Josh?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal answer, and I think it is hard to put a percentage on it, though I did bring a little data to share with you tonight. Every day there's an issue that comes up. First off, the top priority for me is dealing with the heroin and opioid epidemic in my state, which is just brutal, and it's protecting consumers and things like that. But every day there's a sign-on letter or an amicus brief or something like that. We went back and looked. I've been in office just under a year. You're a week ahead of me. And we have been involved in 79 different initiatives involving the federal government. Sometimes that's an amicus brief. Sometimes that's a letter. Sometimes it's some other kind of filing or lawsuit. Now the question is, well, boy, were those 79 times you sued Donald Trump? And the answer is no. We went back and looked. 43 of those 79 had to do with what we believed was an action taken by the Trump administration that harmed the interests of the people of Pennsylvania. So it's roughly 50-50. In fact, we partnered with Indiana on 15 of those items. So there have been opportunities where we work together in a really bipartisan way to protect the interests of our state, either because the federal government isn't doing something or they're overreaching or what have you. And I think you've seen that both Republican and Democratic attorneys general step up and defend the interests of their states, regardless of who's sitting in the White House. So it's a part of what we do. We have lawyers dedicated to working on impact litigation and federalism issues. But it may garner a lot of headlines, but it's by no means at the top of the list of what we do, but it's always present.
Well, let's go back for a second to the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. How you decide to get involved, what you think really implicates what the interests are, and one of the things you mentioned was the partisan or the political aspect of it, and trying to keep that out of it. Bill Clinton, who was once the Attorney General of Arkansas, once said that Attorney General of a state is a great job because if anything is bad or negative, he can just blame it on the Constitution, right? So it was useful for those purposes, and there certainly are plenty of people who've moved from that position as state attorney general into other positions. How do you make sure you're keeping the politics out of it or the partisanship out of it? What happens? Are there processes in the office, or is it just some sort of antenna that you have that says, I've got to make sure I am focused on the right motivations for what I'm doing here?
Well, for me, there's the final process is me. I make the call. So we have a process where the cases come in and they're reviewed and scrutinized by the various members of my staff, whether it comes in through a consumer protection issue or it comes in through some type of other litigation. So it will go through that process and there will be a recommendation. But I review every single one of them, and if I have questions, I'll ask questions about the recommendation. If I have a disagreement, we'll have a follow-up. But there have been times when the recommendation has come through and I've gone the opposite of the recommendation. I think we, fortunately, notwithstanding that we are political figures as Attorney General, as the elected Attorney Generals, most of the people who work for us are not political in that sense. They are conscientious lawyers who are doing their job. So when I get my information from my staff, of course, there can often be issues with political overtones, and there can be memoranda that will address the political overtones from my consideration. But the recommendations are not made based on politics or who wins from a Republican Democrat standpoint. So for me, I'm the final arbiter of when we get in, and I've always considered that the basis for a decision is based on what I feel is right. I can be proven wrong later, but I've always felt, and I used to teach my young deputy prosecutors this, that as long as when you took the action you felt in your heart that it was the right thing to do, then the fact that it may have later determined not to be so right, you can still look yourself in the mirror. And I think it's an individual aspect of that, and I would suggest that that's the case for anyone who is the final arbiter of when to go forward.
General Shapiro, you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And for me, it's actually of the decisions we make, of which there's a lot of complex, difficult decisions every single day, these are relatively straightforward. And for me, there's one test. Does the action by the federal government abide by the rule of law? Period. I'm not for Donald Trump. I didn't vote for him. I hate to break some news here, but it's the truth. I come from a state where Donald Trump won my state, and so did I, right? So I come from one of those true purple states. I don't have to make, and I shouldn't make, political decisions when it comes time to deciding whether to sign on to something or to initiate something. It is only about the rule of law. I've initiated and signed on to a number of things, and I've also stayed off of a number of things that my Democratic colleagues have been involved in. I've been involved with my Republican colleagues on filing suits. So at the end of the day, if you hold yourself simply to that standard of the rule of law and ignore the politics, and ignore sort of the partisan advantages or what have you, you really can make sound judgments and you can sleep at night. And then when the criticism comes, and it comes from both sides, you can take comfort in knowing that you made the decision for the right reasons, and that's what we try to do. I've also surrounded myself with a hell of a team. I mean, I really believe we have, and I mean this is no disrespect, I know you have some members of your team here, I'm sure you'd say the same thing. I think we have the best team in the country.
No, we have the best team.
And my first deputy, which is the top position in my office, is a Republican. So we have people in my operation who are from both sides of the aisle, people from all different walks of life, people who look different from me, who pray to different people than me, and people who come from different places than me. And I think that's a strength of an organization. When you have people like that sitting around the table challenging you, not just yesing you, then it's a lot easier to put the politics aside and the other issues to the side and focus on the one thing that binds us all together, which is the rule of law. And that's how we make each and every one of these decisions.
Are you consulting at all in those situations with any other state officers? For example, the governor. Is the governor, as the chief elected official of the state, is that person part of the inquiry or the consideration that you're thinking about when you get involved?
I mean, I'll just speak for Pennsylvania. I'm elected separate from the governor, even in a separate election cycle. So yes, of course, he's the chief executive of the Commonwealth, but I'm independently elected, and I'm elected to do a different job than he is. He's my friend, I'm an advocate, a supporter of his, but at the end of the day, the decisions we make in our office are based on our judgment. Now, when we're dealing with state agencies or state programs or what have you, they're the experts, and so certainly we're going to engage with them, we're going to talk to them, we're going to get information from them, and that's helpful. But at the end of the day, people elect him to be the governor for a certain reason, they elect me to be the attorney general for a certain reason, and it's my job to be independent of that, of the executive as much as I can and do the right thing.
Consultation with other state officers?
Well, only to the extent that it involves their office in a
Right.
direct way, because we want to make sure they're aware of what's going on. But we're just like Josh. We're independently elected. It's my responsibility to make the call. I don't take that arrogantly, but it's that responsibility to be accountable for that decision. And so I'm not going to abdicate that responsibility in order to, I don't know what we'd call it. I mean, to play nice. We certainly want to all have our oars moving in the right direction, but that doesn't always. That's not always the case. And in the case of an attorney general or governor, sometimes the issues aren't the same. The governor may be addressing a policy issue that's certainly within the realm of he or she's responsibilities. But my responsibility is to address the legal issues. I'm the chief legal officer, and so we take that responsibility very seriously. So in the event of a conflict, we'll make that call.
So as part of making that call and determining whether or not litigation is going to take place, this is part of a much larger phenomenon that's been going on for a while. A couple of statistics to launch us into this area of questioning about some of the actual pieces of litigation you guys have been involved with. Multi-state litigation involving attorneys general, 1 to 4 cases were resolved, which were multi-state attorney general litigation during the 1980s every year, 1 to 4. By 2008, 40 multi-state attorney general cases were resolved. In terms of the sheer number filed from 2009 to 2016 during the Obama administration, 59 multi-state challenges to the Obama administration were filed that led now Texas Governor and then Attorney General Greg Abbott to say, I come into the office, I sue Barack Obama, and then I go home. This is something that has been happening not just as a result of the Obama presidency, but it's been happening since about the mid-1980s, this rise of multi-state litigation. You have been involved in some in the past year. I want to ask about one that is in the news right now, and that's involving DACA and immigration more generally, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. General Shapiro, you were part of a multi-state suit about DACA, and I'd be curious to know, give us a little bit of background about what that suit was about, why you decided to sign on to it, and how what's happened in the past few days is affected by it or will be affected by it.
Sure. First off, it comes back to us in Pennsylvania to examine this in the Attorney General's office, not based on policy, not based on preference, although I certainly have preferences and strong beliefs that the Dreamers should remain here, but based on the rule of law. And when I looked at what the President of the United States did as it related to those Dreamers, and in particular 5,885 of them in my home state of Pennsylvania, I felt that the President violated the rule of law in the way in which he put his order in place. He didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act, and he didn't follow the Constitution. There is a due process argument, I believe, that each and every one of those Dreamers has, right? They, in a basic sense, relied on a promise that was made by the federal government, that in exchange for a fee and for keeping your nose clean, not getting in trouble, and checking back in with us each year, and giving us your address, we're not going to deport you. That was the basic deal that was made. And President Trump came in, did not follow the proper procedures in doing away with all of that. Now, I believe, and this is where I sort of take off my Attorney General hat and just give you my thoughts, I believe the federal government needs to step up and actually do something on immigration and pass real comprehensive immigration reform and ensure that our border is secure. That's outside of my lane, though, as Attorney General. You see, I think Attorneys General can be really powerful forces to ensure that the law is upheld. And that's why I sued over DACA. We are not the answers, though, on policy, on bringing about new policies. That ultimately is going to be left to state legislators and governors and congressmen and senators and the president to do it through the proper channel. Now, as a result of the suits, just last night, the suit that was filed in California, a federal judge ruled that the president couldn't do what he was trying to do and put an injunction in place, essentially allowing the DACA program to continue and finding that there was a strong likelihood on the merits that those of us sort of petitioning here would succeed. Now, at the end of the day, I hope we do succeed in that suit. But what I really hope is that thoughtful, comprehensive immigration reform is adopted at the federal level. It's actually one of the few jobs Congress has, is to deal with immigration. And they haven't done it for 15 years through Democratic and Republican administrations in the White House and leadership in Congress. It's time for them to step up and do that job. But for right now, the practical effect of that holding by the federal judge in California is that everything the president's attempting to do on DACA is on hold.
And the hook, and the hook, just to be clear, the hook for a state, if people are wondering, for a state to become involved, is what? From an immigration perspective?
The impact on our citizens, right? So and the impact on the residents, in this case of Pennsylvania, the 5,885 of them who are impacted by this. And so I have a responsibility, in fact, to stand up for them, and that's why we engage that way. And there's other examples as well, but as a result of a case in Massachusetts back in 2000, forget the exact date, but it was really the first case, Massachusetts versus EPA, where the Supreme Court held that if there is an actual harm to your state or to the people of your state, state attorneys general have this right to stand up and sue on behalf of the people within their borders. And so that's the authority that General Hill, myself, and others are operating under.
General Hill.
The DACA example is one of the most fascinating examples of the process and the problem. And we share some similarities and yet some differences. In my view, DACA came to us as a result of Congress's inability to move on the issue. As you pointed out,
That's right.
it's Congress's responsibility to enact legislation to fix this knot of immigration and this issue of what we do with these children. But here's what happened. Congress did nothing. And as I mentioned earlier, our well-intended President, Obama, took action. In my view, the action that he took was overreach, action that was reserved for the Congress and not for him. I say that having a genuine belief that the provisions that we're talking about with regard to DACA, I absolutely want to see adopted by the Congress. The idea of creating a safe legal environment for these now adults who were children who were brought here is the fair and appropriate thing to do. But I would go back to what we both believe in is the rule of law, and we have a different perspective, but yet similar. Because the issue is, at what point does the president have the authority to take action, and in this particular case, stall out enforcement of immigration, which is what DACA did. It said, we will look the other way because of this circumstance, and a lot of people said that's okay because it's such a sympathetic cause. But we still have to look at, is that the right standard? And it makes it very, very tricky in its application because these are real people who are in the crosshairs that this situation has to be addressed. So I understand, and I think the current president, I think President Trump, even in his action in initially pulling out of DACA, he clearly had some concerns about what he was doing. It took some time in that regard. So it's a very difficult consideration when you're talking about the impact that it has in reality. But it all goes back to if Congress is in a position to do what it, even now we're still talking about negotiating. We're talking about negotiating between a wall and DACA. To me, that's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous to be putting those things in the same vein and suggesting that the president can go ahead and reinstitute DACA if we give him the wall. I want Congress to do their job because this is something that needs to be accomplished without making it some kind of negotiated deal.
Well, let me ask about a couple of questions. A very interesting answer. Are you more apt to challenge the actions of a federal government if it's by presidential executive order? Does that raise your radar a little bit more than if it's an act of Congress in terms of the concept of overreach?
It may be easier to come to that conclusion, but not necessarily more apt to make that decision. I think to me it's much simpler to address whether this was something that belonged in the province of Congress versus the executive. But that doesn't mean that Congress doesn't get beyond the pale as well and interfere in what states do. In fact, we're also seeing, and we've been involved in this now, we're also seeing states that are in conflict. In Indiana, we joined a couple of actions against California because California has enacted some provisions that will affect commerce across the various states. In Indiana, we took the lead in a suit against Massachusetts. Massachusetts had enacted a statute that placed a limitation on chickens. It said that you had to follow the chicken rules that they had in Massachusetts, and basically you had to make sure that your chickens had enough room to stretch out and do all sorts of things that didn't really have anything to really do with the quality of the food, but would have an impact on my farmers in Indiana because my farmers would have to change their way of doing things. So we filed an action against Massachusetts in that regard, very similar to what we would do in a federalism issue.
Transitioning to another issue that's been in the news the past couple of days, marijuana. First thing we think of when we think of federalism is pot. I'm sure that's what everybody thought before they came tonight, but it is, and it is now because of Attorney General Sessions making a determination to roll back some of the Obama-era direction to the Department of Justice in enforcing federal marijuana laws, particularly in states that have legalized marijuana. And the ruling now from the Department of Justice is, feel free to go back to what you were doing at the state level to prosecute whatever is on the federal books, irrespective of what the states have done. One threshold question is, how can states actually regulate in this area at all, or legislate in this area, if the federal government has already spoken? What gives the opportunity for states to pass laws about whether or not marijuana should be legal or medical marijuana is legal, just as a threshold question, so everybody understands that, and then maybe we can dive a little further about maybe where this debate might go.
Well, we're a state where we've legalized medicinal marijuana, not recreational marijuana. And I think we've done that clearly under our authority in the state. I think the 10th Amendment gives us the authority, and this was something passed by a bipartisan group in the legislature and signed by the governor. I think there's, what General Sessions said has been a little bit overblown, I have to say. And a lot is going to depend on the U.S. attorneys in the respective states and what approach they take. And I think our U.S. attorneys in Pennsylvania will take a responsible approach. They're not going to go shut down some legal medicinal marijuana facility that's been licensed by the state, regulated by the state. I don't believe they will do that, though they could under what General Sessions did. And this is sort of an interesting conflict that we have that probably ultimately is going to have to be resolved by the courts. From my perspective, I will do everything in my power to vigorously defend the rights of the Commonwealth and uphold the rule of law in Pennsylvania. I hope it doesn't come in conflict with the Department of Justice, but if it does, so be it. It's my job to protect the laws of Pennsylvania. I do think that General Sessions is way off the mark in terms of his focus on marijuana. We need to be focused together on dealing with the big crises we face. The heroin and opioid epidemic, which is the biggest challenge we face. Meth, which is having a huge resurgence in rural Pennsylvania. I don't know if it is in Indiana, but there's a number of serious challenges out there that need to be addressed, and I want to work closely with the Department of Justice to do that. And quite frankly, I think most of the people in the Department of Justice, certainly the folks I deal with in the FBI and the DEA, U.S. Attorney's offices, really do want to do that as well.
Well, Indiana is still a state in which marijuana is illegal in all its forms, recreational or medicinal. So we don't have a conflict with the federal government in that regard. My personal viewpoint, I'm one of the leading opponents in the state of Indiana for legalization, whether it's medicinal or recreational. I happen to believe that putting the word medicinal onto a substance without going through an FDA process, trial and error and testing for safety and effectiveness is somewhat reckless on the parts of legislators. Getting to what General Sessions did, I see it in a much simpler sense. I don't see it as a matter of whether you're for marijuana or against marijuana. I see it as a rule of law issue. The Cole memo, which was rescinded, basically gave the authority to U.S. attorneys to look the other way with regard to marijuana, to reestablish priorities, et cetera. I'm not saying they couldn't do that, but what General Sessions has done is said, oh, look, this is still the law in the United States government. And as it is the law, it's the responsibility of the executive branch to enforce the law. So I see his actions as nothing more than reasserting the responsibility of the Justice Department on behalf of the executive branch of government to enforce the law. Now, how it's enforced, what will be done, that remains to be seen. But I don't see it as such a bleak moment in that sense. I think he clearly has a very firm approach with regard to marijuana. I don't mind it because it's very similar to my own. I do see, we do have an opioid problem, but I would characterize the problem that we have with drugs and substances as a substance abuse problem altogether. In fact, it's a demand problem. We focus on opioids right now. We're focused on heroin because it gets the headlines. We've got people dying through overdose. It's a dramatic problem. But as you've noted, and it's the same way in Indiana, methamphetamine is still a major problem. Spice, K2, the synthetic, they call it synthetic marijuana, but that's a misnomer. But synthetic drugs, very dangerous. People are dying from that. And a lot of what gets started in the drug world from a substance standpoint begins with marijuana. I'm not suggesting that marijuana has the same level of danger as some of these other drugs, but from a gateway standpoint, from the concept of once you get started, it is more problematic. One of the things that I don't want to see in Indiana, and this is what will happen if marijuana is legalized in Indiana, is the first thing we'll see is more young people smoking pot. And it's not the kind of pot that was around back in the 70s. It's a much stronger variety. And what happens to kids who engage in marijuana use at early ages, prolonged use, can be very detrimental. Not to all, but to some. So I think it's important. I think it's important to recognize what General Sessions' move was related to establishing that the federal government has a responsibility to enforce its laws, and we will see how that plays out in terms of what they actually do from a prioritization.
Let me ask one more question, and then we'll go to audience questions. And it takes in a little bit of what you've both said. You both mentioned the rule of law several times, and that can be a slippery concept. It can mean different things to different people.
Absolutely.
So I want to put it like this. Sitting where you are today, both as experts in the law, is the rule of law stronger or weaker than it was a year ago? Or the same?
I think that while our institutions are under assault, and while leaders of government seem to shrug at the rule of law and shrug at precedent, what we have seen is that our system of checks and balances, maybe not horizontal, but certainly vertical, are working better than ever, and that our institutions are holding, even in the face of the onslaught of activity that President Trump seems to generate each and every day. And that gives me hope, and I'm optimistic. And knowing that there are attorneys general on both sides of the aisle who still strictly adhere to the rule of law, notwithstanding different policy viewpoints on things, it tells me that the system is working. So I remain optimistic. I try to ignore the sort of politics and the daily headlines on the cable news and what have you, and just focus on our institutions. And I think they're holding. I do think it's dangerous, though, when you have the leader of the country assault day in and day out those institutions, whether it's the FBI, or whether it's the media, or whether it's the courts, as the president did today, saying that somehow our court system is broken because a court ruled against him on DACA. To me, that is scary and dangerous. But what I've seen is that the system has held, and it's been strong. And ultimately, I think you all being here and listening and being advocates for whatever your viewpoint is, and then going out into the community and being engaged in the community and speaking about those institutions, not necessarily positively, it can certainly be critical, but doing so in a way that respects those institutions is something that I think is going to help us deal with this chapter that we find ourselves in.
Scary and dangerous, Attorney General Hill. Do you agree with that? Disagree with that?
I agree. I think the institutions are firm and holding, and yet the concern I have is the respect for the institutions, the respect for the rule of law is lacking. Mm-hmm. The understanding of what the rule is, of what law is about and what its purposes are. We have laws to keep us from engaging in chaotic behavior, from dueling in the streets. And it's what I find troubling is that we do have so many that are willing to say, if I disagree with the law, I can ignore the law. Right. That's a grave concern of mine. And it's a very grave concern when I see it happening in government levels. And you're speaking of such things. I mean, that's our real problem. The institutions are holding, but there is a question of how long. Because if we come through a process where lack of respect for the rule of law is able to gain a foothold in who we are as a society, then we're going to have some problems. So right now, I think we're in good shape, but I am concerned about the idea that law is about standards. It's about a society suggesting that we've come together with rules of conduct in terms of how we're going to operate, and we all give up some of our freedom, a little bit of our freedom for the good of all. But when we get to the point where we start saying, well, you know, the law's all good and fine, but what's good for you is good for you, and what's good for you is good for you, what's good for me is good for me, and we step away from that standard in which, that compact that we've made to each other of how we're going to survive as a community, I think we start to lose a lot of the freedoms that, quite frankly, this nation is all about.
I agree.
All right, and with that, we will go to audience questions. Just a reminder, the first three will come from students.
Hi, is this on? Is it? Yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Michael Sidver, and I'm a third year in the college and just turned 21, and that brings me to my question on federalism. So we have at the state level and kind of all across the country, a very selective enforcement of alcohol laws, and we have one of the highest drinking ages in the country and one of the highest instances, or in the world, and one of the highest instances of drunk driving in the world. Is our drinking age too high, and is our selective enforcement, or the way the federal government has kind of enforced this blanket age across the country, unjust or broken?
You want to take that?
I don't know if I can. I don't know that and I'm not aware of that there's a blanket law on alcohol across the country. Each state has its own rules with regard to alcohol use as well as alcohol abuse.
I think that's, I was just saying that the age is tied to federal highway funding.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a different concern, I think, because I know that that brings up an interesting issue of control. And much of the federal government's ability to control what goes on in states is tied to money, whether it's through the education process, through the highway process. And a very simple way of stopping that control is, guess what? Don't take the money. Mm-hmm. But good luck with that. Because once these millions of dollars start flowing in for highways, or these millions of dollars come in for education, it's like a drug. It's like it's like you can't stop. And so that control level comes into play. So what happens in a situation like that? It's a contract. We're going to give you $15 billion if you make the drinking age 21 years of age. Well, if you don't want that, don't do it. The states have that responsibility or that right to do so. It's a position that I've talked about, at least theoretically, when it comes to education, because I think, at least from my standpoint, I want to see an education system that is really driven by local policies and local interests, and oftentimes we get caught up into a federal thing, and the reason is because we've got federal dollars tied into it.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you.
Hi. This was something that came up in the question about marijuana. But in general, when it comes to selective enforcement of different laws that are on the books, and even readings through the State Attorney General's Office of the laws on the book, what are your philosophies toward that, and how does that sort of impact your daily job in terms of deciding what to enforce, what not to, and how it might differ from year to year?
What do you mean when you say selective enforcement?
Just, in the example of the marijuana case, with one administration sends a letter, don't really push it, and then another administration sends a letter saying, this is something that we are going to be pushing
If
hard.
the laws are on the books and then choosing
in different
to enforce them or
jurisdictions.
not.
Right. And because the law it's written, it's on the books, and once it's there, it's there.
My view is it's my job to enforce the law, period. I don't get to make the law. I'm not a lawmaker, I'm a law enforcer. Now, we also have limited resources and limited time, and so I have to set the priorities for my office as to what we're going to pursue and how hard we're going to pursue it, how many man and woman hours we're going to put at something. And that's my job. That's what I got elected to do. And if people don't like my priorities or what issues I think are important to go after, they're going to pick somebody else in a few years to do the job. So I don't think it's so much about selective enforcement, as you called it. I do think it's about what your priorities are and recognizing that we have our own viewpoints, we have limited resources, and we need to go out and tackle the problems that we think are the most important for our respective states.
And I would characterize what you call selective enforcement as discretion, and that discretion takes into a variety of considerations. It takes into consideration the tenor of your community. Each community or each states are different, And within each state, you have a variety of different communities and community standards. And so a job that we would have in our respective states is to not be tone deaf to what's going on in our environment. Some of the states have extreme differences. I don't think Pennsylvania and Indiana are that way, but there are some states where, well, I'll give you an example, California and just about everybody else. Big difference. And so California has their way of doing it. We have our way of doing it in Indiana. That works for folks in California for the most part. What we do works for folks in Indiana. And you can go right down to the various counties where they have their own law enforcement or their own district attorneys, and that discretion is in place to work through priorities, to balance resources, because we don't have the resources to make a major case out of everything. So we have to look at what are the priorities in our community, what do the people want to solve. In our states, right now, opioid is a #1 issue across the board. So that's a lot of resource that Josh's office, my office, and the sub-offices of the various other agencies within our states are going to focus on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for
You
being
got to
here.
take a trip to the bookstore, man. Maybe wearing a Michigan sweatshirt here for it.
Thank you both for being here. I do appreciate it. My question is that some critics of the Department of Justice have written recently that it's been somewhat reluctant to prosecute financial services firms in lieu of just opting to settle for large cash settlements. I think the speculation was that this was related to like a perceived sense of overreach during Enron and Arthur Andersen. My question is, when these kind of gaps do occur, do you feel that state attorneys general have a role to fill in stepping up? Or if not, please help me understand why.
Well, I could tell you, we've been very robust in our efforts investigating and filing suits against major corporations when they've done wrong. And whether the federal government's going after it or not, I have a responsibility to protect the interests of my state. So for example, Navient, formerly Sallie Mae, one of the biggest student loan providers in the country, the biggest. We think that they have taken, quite literally, over $4 billion out of the pockets of students, parents, families, what have you, as a result of their predatory practices. They have a major operation in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I sued them, and I sued them not just on behalf of the tens of thousands of students in Pennsylvania, but because their operation is in Pennsylvania, and it affects students all across the country, the millions across the country who are affected. So we're not taking our foot off the gas pedal when it comes to going after corporations that do wrong and do things that ultimately harm consumers. That's a serious focus of the work we do, and you know, we hope that we'll have strong partnerships at the federal level to work with us on those things, but if not, we're prepared to do it. I will say that attorneys general working together on these things are one of the best things happening in America right now. Now, I recognize a lot of the questions you want to ask is about Trump and this and that, but the truth is we do a lot together in really meaningful ways. I mean, think about what happened with tobacco. I think we are on the verge of something significant like that when it comes to the opioid manufacturers and distributors. There's 41 state attorneys general working together on that. There are 47 states working together to investigate what happened with Equifax, get to the bottom of it, and recover a whole lot of money for our respective states because Equifax quite likely failed to notify our states of the breach based on our respective state laws as it relates to notification. So there are example after example where the states individually, as we're doing on Navient, and then collectively, as we're doing on opioids, on Equifax and other things, working together to hold corporations accountable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again. My question is regarding the litigation you ultimately pursue as states. So I know for Supreme Court justices, for example, the students who choose or who interview with the Supreme Court justices to become law clerks often choose justices that share the same ideology as they do. And I'm curious that often states attorneys generals run, and just as politicians, you see at the end of their name, you see an R or D indicating Republican or Democrat. I'm curious if you believe that there is a self-selection effect among your own staff and whether or not that affects your litigation, given that you both mentioned that often the first pair of eyes on the litigation that you choose to bring are people of your own staff.
I think there's a mix. I personally do not have a litmus test for who works for me. When we have interviews for lawyers, I'm not concerned about their political persuasion. I'm concerned about their skills. I think certainly I do have a particular set of political baggage that I bring to the office myself, but that's my responsibility in an elected position, and it doesn't really go too far beyond me in that sense. So we certainly don't look for that. At least I don't look for that type of you guys all have to be Republican. Now, I can't say that it doesn't hurt that, particularly in our Solicitor General's role in terms of having someone who may have like-minded views, because it's probably more likely that they're going to come through with concepts that I will find more favorable. But having said that, I probably have more Democrats, and I really don't know, working in my office than I do Republicans. And I'm hopeful that I'm getting a balanced approach at issues that I can review and evaluate. It's my responsibility to deal with the political side of things, but we don't need to do that in terms of who we're bringing in and making sure that they have the same political stripe. At least that's how we do it in Indiana, or how we don't do it in Indiana.
If I can just ask one question that goes to that, does a question like that, which is based on potential partisanship, and the fact that attorney generals run for office in 43 states, that the Republican Attorney Generals Association and Democratic Attorney Generals Association raised about $20 million last year. There's about $6 million being spent right now in the Virginia Attorney General's race. You've both made eloquent cases for making determinations for the right reasons, but as you look at the long arc of not just yourselves, but the offices themselves, do you worry that there is a perception, or will be a perception, with that politicization, that the offices are institutionally really not so much about law and more about politics? Do you worry about that over the long haul?
I do worry about that over the long haul. And I will say, just to answer your question and yours, try and do that together, I don't want people sitting around that table making a decision with me who all think like me. Because, I mean, look, I won the election. I get to make the decision at the end of the day. So when I finally get to that small table, I want to have people who challenge me and think differently than me. As I said before, my first deputy is a Republican. She was a Republican office holder. I want people who view the world differently than me, who have different philosophical viewpoints, and who can really challenge me. I do worry that in the process of all of this, particularly the way a lot of the actions we have get, and the coverage they get, does politicize the office. I mean, really, a lot of what we do is nonpartisan. It doesn't get headlines, but it's nonpartisan. And I worry because I think the public really needs parts of government, especially attorneys general, to be working outside of the daily grind of politics that you see and are so frustrated by when you look at what's going on in Congress. So the more we can operate outside of that, the better. For my part, look, I'm a proud Democrat, right? And I have views that are in line with the Democratic Party. Not all, but many. But I believe at the end of the day that when I got this job, you have to separate yourself a little bit from the daily grind of politics in order to do the job in a way that people have confidence and faith in the work you're doing. And then at the end of the day, you're adhering not to a political party or a party platform, but just simply to the rule of law.
Can you speak on that for 1 minute about your office's position on the travel ban and how it changed from the first travel ban to the second? And that might shed some light on that decision-making process a little bit.
So I'm in office for literally a week, and the president announced on a Friday evening his first travel ban or Muslim ban or whatever you want to refer to it as. And by Saturday, I mean, there was really chaos in our country, chaos in airports, and by the way, chaos within the Trump administration, because it was clear that they really didn't have a clue what they were trying to do. And everybody said, we have to sue. We got to file litigation. We got to do something about this. And rather than reacting to what was in the news, we actually read the president's order. And I found it to be completely violative of the law, totally in violation of the law. And we led a group of amici states in supporting the litigation that started in Washington state.
Friend of the court briefs.
Friend of the court brief. So the president ultimately agreed with us, right? I mean, he withdrew his first travel ban. And then he issued 2 more travel bans. And my office did not sign on. And I was criticized for not signing on. And I said, well, remember the first time when I signed on, I said it was about the rule of law. Well, it's still about the rule of law. It doesn't mean I like what the president's doing. I think the president should not be doing what he's doing. My personal opinion is it makes us less safe. My personal opinion is that it undermines our diplomatic standing around the world. But at the end of the day, my job is to uphold the rule of law, and we did not sign on to that. So, you know, I feel pretty consistent in my approach. Look at the law, look at what the president, or anyone for that matter, is doing, and apply the law without fear and without favor. And that's what we try to do.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Attorney generals in 43 states are now elected, and there's been a recent trend that a lot of attorney generals run for higher offices after attorney general. As to attorneys generals, why do you feel that like attorney generals, you know, after they serve their term, continue to run to, you know, subsequent higher offices?
Why they do run?
Yeah, why they do run.
What could be a higher office?
U.S. Senate?
Senate, governor, president.
Well, I think Josh makes a good point. I mean, until I had this job as Attorney General, the greatest job I ever had was prosecutor. Part of the reason that he says his job as Attorney General is the greatest job is because he is the prosecutor. And I miss that aspect because prosecutor is a wonderful job. You keep people safe in your own community. And you know, I can't think of a job that's better. I can't think of a job that's more noble, a job that's more worthy. You know, people think higher office, you know, I can't say that either of us would not run for another office one day, but it's hard to suggest that we would run for an office that would have as much direct impact on our statewide community than the job we have right now. You know, the Senate's got a great title, and maybe you have the keys to the executive washroom, but I'm with the people. I'm making decisions on a regular basis that are localized and have a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of Hoosiers. And I enjoy that aspect of what I do. So I think part of what goes into the issue of seeking another office is there something about one's skill set or interest that suggests, and it ought to be, can I serve in another way that will help more people? I hated giving up the job I had, but I love what I do now because I'm able to serve in a greater capacity, still serve those people who I used to serve, but I'm serving even more in that capacity.
I heard that General Hill is never running for another office. That's what I heard.
That's what I
And the same from General Shapiro. Okay, thank you.
Many pundits on cable channels have been saying that if President Trump pardons various people like Michael Flynn or Paul Manafort, state attorneys general can conduct a prosecution in the face of a presidential pardon. I hope that's true, but I'm not sure that it is. One could make the argument that pardon would be meaningless if it didn't preempt federal prosecution or state prosecutions. And indeed, there was no state criminal law at the founding period. So do you agree with that idea that attorneys general could prosecute people that have been pardoned by the president?
I'm not aware of any standard that would allow for that.
That would allow for a state
For a
prosecution?
state's attorney general to prosecute under the circumstances you've described.
But I have a couple things. First off, stop watching cable news. That's the first thing I would say. Except when David Axelrod is on, then you should watch. Look, I think it would be irresponsible for me to opine on any figures involved in the current scandal involving Russia. In general, if an actor was found to have been was found to have violated a federal and state law, and let's say for argument's sake the state law is Pennsylvania. If the president pardoned her or him, that action to pardon would only be to relieve them of the charges at the federal level. And so then you would look at any sort of double jeopardy laws that existed under state law to determine whether or not double jeopardy would be at play. And if it was not at play, then certainly a state prosecutor would be able to prosecute an individual.
So potentially, the two of you disagree on that question.
Potentially.
Potentially.
I think it's an unusual example, but I'm not. I see that as a federal issue. I see that as first of all, the pardon, and I'm no expert in this area, but my understanding is the pardonability is absolute. So to the degree that it engages in some type of inappropriate behavior, that would be something for the Congress to deal with pursuant to the rules of the Constitution.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Madalena Parsons. I'm a first year in the college. So in March, in the Illinois primary, we'll be electing a new Attorney General. Our current Attorney General is not running for a 5th term. As a first-time voter, I'm wondering, what do you think we should be looking for in a good Attorney General? Like, what should we look for in a candidate that would suggest that they will serve us well in your office?
Well, I'm not endorsing any one of the 8,000 people running for Attorney General here in Illinois, and Lisa Madigan's done a great job, and she's a good friend. I think you should hire somebody who understands the job. I think you should hire somebody who recognizes the serious challenges that exist in Illinois and has a real plan to do something about it. I think you should elect someone who respects the rights of all people here in Illinois, no matter what they look like or who they love or who they pray to or where they're from, and someone who's going to bring folks together and protect the interests of the state of Illinois. That's what I think you ought to do.
I think you should elect someone you can believe. I think the most important aspect of service is to be able to speak your truth. And I know that when I look at people who are in elected positions, the ones who I support are the ones who I believe what they say they believe. Yeah. And so being able to identify someone who can speak the truth to you, who doesn't try to pander, who doesn't say, well, let's see, this side of the room thinks this and this side of the room thinks that, so I'm going to talk to you guys about this, I'm going to talk to you guys about that. The difficulty with that is you can't keep it straight. The neat thing about telling the truth, you can't get caught up in a lie. So you just tell it like it is, you tell it how it is, and what I have found is that people appreciate who you are and they believe in your integrity. I have people who disagree with me all the time. That's okay, but I have people who respect me because they understand that I have firm convictions, but when I make a point, I try to illuminate what my rationale is, and I try to listen to the other side. I think that's imperative. So you're looking for people who will speak the truth that you can believe in, you can count on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Thanks to you both for being here. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'm a second-year student at the law school and spent last summer bridging the geographic divide between you two at the Ohio Attorney General's office. And one of the hot topics of conversation there was when attorneys general refused to defend a state law or state action. And that was shortly after the Sally Yates decision to not defend one of the administration's actions on the national level. So I'm curious your thoughts on whether attorneys general as the state's law firm have a duty to defend state actions, and is there a law or an action that you would choose not to defend hypothetically?
Great question.
It is
Very good question.
It's the Attorney General's responsibility to defend the Indiana laws. And sometimes we don't like those laws, but it's my responsibility. and to defend them vigorously. Now, what I've tried to establish in my tenure, which is very short so far, is a relationship with our General Assembly where I've said, look, don't enact crap and then expect me to pull it out. We're not magicians here. Let us help you in the beginning. Come to us and talk to us about what you have in mind so we can help map out a course that stays within the Constitution or makes practical sense. And we're getting some bites. That's not something that our General Assembly has been too used to, so we got to take baby steps in that regard. But it's our responsibility to defend the laws of our state, even when those laws are against our personal interest or personal belief system.
Yeah, I totally agree with General Hill. I mean, there are laws on the books I don't agree with, but my job is to uphold the law, period. There is a mechanism in Pennsylvania law that allows me to opine as to the constitutionality of something. Ultimately, the courts make the judgment, and our state Supreme Court has the final say on that. But I mean, you could envision a scenario where I'm being called upon to do something that is clearly unconstitutional, where I have some flexibility in that office to be able to express my views as it relates to that particular provision. And certainly as a lawyer, I can't take an action that would be unconstitutional. But I hope a scenario like that does not come up. I'm not aware of a particular law that is unconstitutional. And I think you have to just stay very consistent on these issues. And sometimes people like what you do, and sometimes people don't like what you do. But as General Hill said before, I mean, people respect when you have a core. People respect when you have convictions. People respect when you remain consistent on things. Doesn't mean you can't evolve. It doesn't mean your viewpoints can't change or what have you over time. But I think consistency is important. People want that from the chief law enforcement officers, chief legal officers of their respective states.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for those questions. And I think we've come to the close of the program, or at least all the zeros in front of me would indicate that. I want to thank everybody for the wonderful questions and for being here tonight, and for the Institute for having the event and the Institute staff for putting it together. Most of all, I want to thank our two guests. As we sail these very choppy waters of the future, and particularly in the area of federalism, it's nice to know we have two very thoughtful people and that we're in good hands as we do it. So let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. That was really good. Yeah, really good job. Do it again. Yeah, I would like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here.